A locked file, a sleeping shop, a sweet on the tongue. He thought he was setting the trap. He had been walking into hers since October and neither knew it yet. Our story begins in this very moment. The vial had been in his fist so long it had taken the temperature of his blood, and that was the part he couldn't forgive himself for, that it had stopped feeling like glass and started feeling like a part of his hand. Draco Malfoy stood in the corridor outside courtroom 9 with his back against the wall and his shoulder blades pressed to coldstone, and counted the footsteps coming up from the far end. Not hers. Too heavy, too unhurried, a man's stride with nothing waiting for it. The lamps down here burned green in their brackets, and the light did unkind things to everyone it touched. He had watched 3 months of witnesses walk into that courtroom looking like drowned men before they ever opened their mouths. The summons was in his breast pocket, folded into eighths. He had done that on the second day, folded it small enough to disappear, and then found himself taking it out at odd hours to check that the words hadn't rearranged themselves into something survivable. In the matter of the reopened inquiry into the estate and associates of the House of Malfoy. Below it, a list. And in the list, 3 letters that had stopped his breath in his mother's morning room, in front of his mother, while she poured tea with a steady hand and pretended not to see him go white. N.B. Malfoy. Not summoned. Not yet. Named. Which was a different animal entirely, a thing that could sleep in a file for a year and then wake up hungry. She had gone on pouring. That was the detail he kept returning to, turning it over like a coin worn smooth. Narcissa Malfoy had lifted the pot, and the amber had come down in a thin, unbroken line into the cup, and she had said, "Drink it while it's hot, darling." And her hand had not trembled once, and he had understood that she already knew, and had known for weeks, and had decided that he was not to be told. He had been 8 years old the last time she had lied to him that kindly. There had been a dead owl in the garden then. She had told him it had flown away. So he had begun, methodically and without any illusion about what he was doing, to break the law. The first attempt had been legitimate, and he wanted that on some record somewhere, even if only in his own accounting. He had filed a petition for disclosure. He had paid a solicitor 200 galleons to write it in the flat, bloodless language they liked, and he had signed it with his own name in his own hand, and a clerk had returned it 11 days later with a single line stamped across the front in violet ink. Denied. Standing not established. He had read it 4 times, standing at the counter of the filing office with the Q building behind him, before he understood that the ministry had just informed him he was not sufficiently related to his own mother. The second attempt had involved Ogdens, a great deal of it, and a man named Tolliver from Records, who had a weakness for it. Draco had spent an entire evening in a public house in Bermondsey, being charming, actually charming, which cost him more than money, and had come away with the number of the file, its shelf, and the schedule of the wards. 2 days later, Tolliver was gone from Records, and Draco had learned about it from the Prophet's back pages, a paragraph so small it might have been an advertisement for boot polish. He had not slept that night. Not from fear, from the arithmetic. He had reached for something, and a man's life had come off in his hand, and he had not even got the thing. The third attempt had been the shelf itself. He had made it as far as the ward line and stood there in the dark with his wand out and his pulse going in his throat, and the wards had tasted him. That was the only word. They had tasted him, a slow, cold pressure sliding over his skin like something deciding. And he had lowered his wand and walked away and been sick, quietly and thoroughly, in a lavatory on level 6, which left one door. It had been standing open the whole time, the way the worst doors always are, and he had refused to look at it for 11 days, because looking at it meant admitting what he was prepared to do. One living person had read the entire record, not the summary, not the redacted brief that circulated among the junior council. The whole file, every deposition, every marginal note, every name a frightened witness had traded for leniency 2 winters ago. She sat on the review board. Her office was on 4. She took her tea black, and she was, by all accounts, incorruptible. The footsteps at the end of the corridor changed. He knew them before he knew them, which was its own small humiliation, and he had time to arrange his face, and not enough time to arrange anything underneath it. Quick, even, decisive. The particular rhythm of someone who has never in her life dawdled toward a room. Hermione Granger came up the corridor with a stack of folders braced against her hip and a quill pushed into her hair and forgotten there. And the green lamplight, which had made corpses of better people, simply moved over her and went on its way. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow. There was a smear of ink on the inside of her left wrist, the shape of a comma. He noticed it and immediately resented himself for noticing it, because a man about to do what he was about to do had no business cataloguing the small human evidence of his target. Target. The word arrived in his own voice, and he found he could not put it back. She saw him. He watched her see him. A half-beat break in the stride, so brief that anyone who hadn't spent 7 years of his adolescence studying her would have missed it entirely. Then the stride resumed. Malfoy. Granger. That was all. She passed him. The folders shifted against her hip, and one corner of parchment caught the air and turned over with a dry sound, the tooth of old paper against paper. And underneath it, he caught something faint and green and bruised, the smell of crushed stems, the residue of whatever she'd been brewing or handling that morning. And then she was 4 paces past him, and the corridor was giving her footsteps back off its walls, hollow, doubled, receding. He had not moved. His fist was still closed. Inside it, the glass had gone as warm as skin. Granger. She stopped. She did not turn immediately, and in the half-second before she did, he had the disorienting sense that she had been waiting for this, standing very still the way you stand when a wasp has landed on your sleeve and you have decided not to swat it yet. Then she came around. Yes? He had prepared nothing. 11 days of arithmetic and 3 failed attempts, and he had prepared not one word, because every version he'd built in his head had collapsed the moment he imagined her actual face in it, that steady, unbothered attention she turned on everything, and now here it was, and he had to speak into it. You dropped something, he said. 2 corridors back, by the lift. Her eyebrows went up a fraction. Did I? A note, blue ink. He shrugged one shoulder, a small, precise motion, The kind a man makes when a thing is beneath his interest. I didn't read it. You read it. I read the first line. Something moved at the corner of her mouth, not a smile. The place a smile would go if it were allowed. And it was a laundry list, he said, which I found deeply disappointing given the security clearance. The silence that followed had a texture to it. Down the corridor, a door opened and closed, and someone laughed at something, and the sound came to them thinned and strange from another world where people laughed in corridors. "Level 9, Hermione said. He blinked. "What?" "That's where I dropped it." She adjusted the folders against her hip, and her chin came up slightly, and he understood with a lurch that he had just been handed something and had no idea yet whether it was a gift or a hook. "Not by the lift on 2. I was on 9 this morning. The archive stacks, the ventilation's appalling, and half the lamps have gone, so if you're going to lie about where you found my note, at least lie about a floor I've been on." His pulse did something complicated. "I never said which lift." "You said 2 corridors back." She held his eyes. Hers were very steady and not remotely unkind, which was somehow worse. "There's 1 lift on this level, Malfoy, and it's behind you." The lamp above them guttered, took, steadied. In the flare he saw the ink comma on her wrist again, and thought, absurdly, she writes on herself when she's out of parchment, and felt the ground of the whole enterprise shift beneath him. "I'm in the stacks again tonight," she said. 9. Until about 8, if the ventilation doesn't kill me first. She turned, then turned back, entirely without hurry. "You could just ask, you know, whatever it is." "I don't want anything." "No," she agreed. "Of course not." And she walked away, and this time he did not call her back. And he stood in the green light listening to the hollow report of her footsteps until the sound had thinned to nothing and the corridor was only stone again. He opened his hand. The vial lay across his palm, warm as a living thing, the liquid inside so perfectly clear that it seemed to be nothing at all. No colour, no shadow, no answer for the light passing through it. 3 drops. That was the dose. 3 drops and no witnesses, and an hour in which a person could not construct a single lie, not even the small merciful ones, not even the ones they told themselves. He thought of his mother's hand, steady on the teapot. He thought of Tolliver's name in 6-point type on the back page. He thought, and this was the part he could not afterward account for, of a smear of ink shaped like a comma on the inside of a wrist, and of how she had said you could just ask, as though it were a real thing a person could do, as though the world had ever once been arranged that way for him. His fingers closed. The glass bit into the join of his knuckles, and he let it, and stood there a moment longer with his hand shut and his jaw set. Then he pushed off the wall and went to find the stairs down to level 9. Level 9 did not announce itself. The lift simply stopped being a lift and became a mouth, and the grill rattled back on a darkness that smelled of cold iron and something older underneath it, the dry mineral breath of paper that has been left alone with itself for 50 years. Draco stepped out, and the doors closed behind him and took their light with them. For a moment, he stood in absolute black. Then, one by one, down the length of the aisle, the lamps woke. Not brightly, not all at once, but grudgingly, each guttering up to a small sullen flame, as if resenting the interruption. They hung on iron hooks between the stacks, and their light did not reach the ceiling. It went up perhaps 10 feet, and then gave out, and above that was nothing. A dark that might have been a vault or might have been open sky, and the shelves went up into it and did not stop. He had been raised in a house with a library like a cathedral, and he had never once found it frightening. This was different. This was the memory of a country stored in boxes, and half of it was about him. He walked. His shoes struck the flagstones, and the sound went ahead of him down the aisle and came back doubled, hollow, arriving a half-beat late so that he seemed to be following someone. Every 8 paces, the lamps thinned, and the shadows between the stacks opened like doorways. Behind the shelving on his left, ledgers were stacked spine out to the height of a man, and the leather had cracked in long dry seams, and there was dust on them so undisturbed that it lay in a soft grey nap like felt. 3rd row from the end, Tolliver had said, 4 months ago and 3 drinks in. Wards go on at 9 and off at 6, and there's a dead hour at 7 when the day shift's gone and the night warder's still on 8 having his tea. It was 7:10. He found her by the light before he found her by anything else. A warmer glow spilling out of an aisle ahead, a different quality altogether from the mean green flames on their hooks. She had conjured her own lamp. Of course she had. She had come down into a place with failing light and simply made better light, and the small, unreasonable arrogance of that made something twist under his ribs that was not, unfortunately, contempt. He stopped at the mouth of the aisle. Hermione was sitting on the floor, not at a table. There was a table, a long, scarred oak thing with a brass rail, 6 feet away and entirely unused. She was on the flagstones with her back against the shelf, legs stretched out and crossed at the ankle, shoes off and set neatly side by side beyond her feet, and a ledger open across her lap the size of a paving slab. The lamp floated at her shoulder, a soft globe of buttery light, and it made a small room out of 6 feet of stone floor and left everything past it in blue dark. She did not look up. You took 4 hours. I had things to do. You had nothing to do. The Wizengamot's not sitting, and your solicitor's been barred from the building. She turned a page. The paper made that sound again, dry and toothy, and she flattened the crease with the side of her hand. You were deciding. Draco stayed where he was, one shoulder against the end of the stack, and made himself take a slow breath through his nose. She's guessing. She guesses well. She always did. It doesn't mean anything. Deciding what? That's rather the question. The lamp above the aisle behind him gave a small crack as the flame found a flaw and steadied. He came forward 3 paces into the edge of her light and looked down at the top of her head, the quill still stabbed into her hair and still forgotten, a curl escaping around it, and found he did not want to be looking down at her and did not want to sit either, and so stood there in the ridiculous middle distance like a man waiting for a train. You said the ventilation was appalling, he said. You lied. It's not appalling. It's non-existent. It's better on the floor. She still hadn't looked up. Heat rises. So does the dust. Everything above 4 feet in this room is 50 years of dead skin and pulped rag, and you're standing in it, breathing it, and you'll cough all night. Charming. Sit down then. I'm not sitting on the floor. Now she looked up, The lamp was at her shoulder, so half her face was lit and half was not, and the lit half had an expression on it he did not care for at all. Not hostility, not triumph. Patience. The patience of a woman with an entire evening and nowhere she needed to be. "You're not sitting on the floor," she repeated, "in a room where you came, uninvited, at 7 o'clock in the evening, because there's something down here you want, and you haven't worked out how to ask for it." She closed the ledger. The sound was flat and final, a door in a stone corridor. "Do you know, Malfoy, that's almost the most Malfoy sentence I've ever heard. Dignity right down to the last inch of the fall." His jaw set. He felt it happen, the muscle going hard at the hinge, and he knew she saw it, because her eyes went there, briefly, and came back. He sat down, not close. Across the aisle from her, back against the opposite shelf, one knee up and his wrist draped over it, and he arranged himself very deliberately so that the arrangement itself was a kind of statement. The flagstones were shockingly cold through his trousers. Somewhere far off in the stacks, something settled, a shelf easing under its own weight, a sound like a long breath let out. "Better," Hermione said. "Don't." "Don't what?" "Don't do the voice, the one you use on frightened juniors and house elves." Something flickered in her face. He'd landed it. He felt the small, vicious satisfaction of that, and then, immediately after, an unfamiliar drop in the stomach, because he had not actually wanted to land it, and he had done it anyway out of pure reflex, the way a man throws up a hand in front of his face. "All right," she said, and her voice had changed, lower, drier, entirely without the patience. "Then let's not. You want the Malfoy file." The lamp hissed. He did not move a muscle. He had spent 11 days learning not to move a muscle, but his fingers, resting over his knee, had closed, and he looked down and saw the knuckles standing out white through the skin, and unclosed them one at a time, slowly, and knew it was already too late. "There's an inquiry," he said. "There's a file. Anyone in the building could have guessed as much. Anyone in the building didn't try to get into row 12 on the 18th of last month at 11 at night." Everything in him went very still. "The wards keep a record," she said. "Not of names. They're not that clever. Of intent. Somebody stood at the line for 2 minutes and 11 seconds with a drawn wand and didn't cross it, and the record went to the review board on the Monday, and I read it on the Monday, and I have been waiting since the Monday to see what you do next." She tilted her head. In the half-light, her eyes had gone very dark. 2 minutes and 11 seconds is a long time to stand still, Malfoy. What were you doing? Reconsidering. That's a very good answer. A pause. Is it true? Yes. And it was, and the truth of it sat between them on the cold floor like a third person, and he hated it. He had come down here to begin a long and careful piece of work, the slow construction of a version of himself she could be persuaded to like. And instead, he had sat on the flagstones and said yes to her in the first 10 minutes. And it had cost him nothing to say, and that was the alarming part. Hermione set the ledger aside. She did it carefully, aligning its edge with the shelf, and he watched her hands do it, and then watched her fingers go, quick, quite unconscious, to the cuff of her rolled sleeve, and turn it once, and smooth it flat against her forearm, though it had been perfectly flat before. He filed that away, and immediately wished he hadn't. "I can't give it to you," she said. I haven't asked. You will. I won't. He said it too fast. He heard himself say it too fast. He looked away from her, down the aisle, into the blue dark where the lamps gave out. Asking's not an option. If you gave it to me, you'd be finished. Not disciplined, finished, out, name in the profit, the whole 2 years of you undone in a fortnight. And by the time it was done, nobody would remember what the file said. Only that Granger handed the Malfoys their own inquiry. His mouth twisted. You've got about 4 enemies on that board who'd pay to watch it. There was a silence. 6, she said. 6. You missed Prewitt and the Irish one. Something almost like amusement moved across her, gone as fast as it came. Then it went, and what was underneath it was serious. So, you've thought about what it would cost me. I've thought about the mechanics. That isn't what I said. The lamplight shifted as it drifted an inch on its own current, and the shadows in the aisle swung slowly and came back, and for a moment the whole space seemed to breathe. Why, Hermione said, does a man who is not going to ask come down 9 floors at 7 o'clock? And there it was, the place where he was supposed to begin lying, where the plan, the actual architecture of the plan, required him to say something disarming and slightly rueful, to lay the first plank of 8 weeks' patient carpentry. He had the sentence ready. He'd had it ready in the corridor upstairs. Because you're the only person in this building who doesn't look at me like a stain. It was even true, which was what would have made it work. He opened his mouth and could not say it. It sat behind his teeth and would not come. And in the 2 seconds of that failure, he understood something about himself that he would spend a great deal of the following weeks trying to understand. That he could lie to her about facts, about floors and lifts and blue ink all day and twice on Sunday, and could not, apparently, lie to her about why he had come to look at her. My mother's name is in it, he said. The words came out flat and quiet, and did not sound like his voice at all. Hermione did not react the way people reacted. She didn't soften, didn't perform sympathy, didn't reach. She went very still, the way she had in the corridor upstairs, and her eyes stayed on his face, and she let the sentence exist for a full 3 seconds before she said anything at all. Named or summoned? Named. Then she's not a defendant. Not yet. He heard the crack in it and pressed his lips together and got his voice back down. She's 61. She hasn't left the house in 2 years except to see me. If they take her in for questioning under caution, she will answer every single thing they ask, correctly, politely, and she will hand them her own throat, because that is what she has decided is owed. He looked at the floor. The flagstones had a chip in them the shape of Anglesey. She won't tell me what's coming. She thinks she's being kind. The stacks were quiet. Far above them, out of the reach of the light, something in the dark went tick. Once, the small sound of old wood remembering the day's heat. I can't give you the file, Hermione said again. But it was different this time. Not a wall, a statement of geography, the shape of a country they were both now standing in. And I won't pretend I don't know what you'll try next. You don't. Malfoy. She drew her knees up and wrapped her arms round them, and the movement put her chin level with his, and it occurred to him that she had done that deliberately. There are 4 ways left, One of them ends with you in Azkaban. One of them ends with an obliviation you'd have to perform yourself and couldn't. One of them's a bribe, and you've already burnt Tolliver." She watched him flinch and did not spare him. "Yes, I know about Tolliver. He's alive. He's in Cardiff. He has a job. And the fourth one is the one people always end up at when they've run out of the others." His pulse was going hard now, in his throat, at the wrists. "And what's that?" Hermione looked at him for a long moment across 6 feet of stone. "Getting close enough," she said, "that I stopped noticing your hands." The lamp guttered. In the swung shadow, her face went briefly unreadable, and then the flame took again, and she was only a woman sitting on a cold floor in her stocking feet with a quill in her hair. He got up. He did it too quickly, and his shoulder rang against the shelf, and a ledger shifted somewhere above him with a dry slither, and he put a hand up to steady it without looking, and stood there, breathing with his palm flat against 50-year-old leather. "You've a very high opinion of your own attractions, Granger." "I've a very accurate opinion of desperation." She hadn't moved. "That wasn't an accusation. It was a warning, and I don't give many, and I'd rather you took it as it was meant." "Meaning what?" "Meaning don't." Her voice went quiet, and for the first time all evening, something in it was not entirely steady. "Because I'm not stupid, and I'll know, and I'd rather have you standing in the door of my archive being unbearable about the ventilation than have you spend 2 months being charming at me and find out at the end of it that none of it was real." The dust hung in the lamplight between them, turning, catching, going out. Draco took his hand down off the shelf. 8 o'clock, he said. "You said you'd be here till 8. I did. It's 20 past. Hermione glanced at the lamp as though it might have the time, which it did not, and then back at him, and the thing that crossed her face then was not patience or amusement or warning, but something rawer and much more tiring, and she let him see it for perhaps half a second before it went. "So it is," she said. He turned and walked out of her light, down the long aisle with his own doubled footsteps coming back at him off the stone, and did not look round, and got as far as the lift with his hand already out for the grill before he stopped, stood there in the dark with his fingers an inch from the iron, the vial a small dead weight against his ribs, hearing her not follow him, and then turned on his heel and started back. She had not moved. That was the first thing he saw when he came back into the aisle, that she was exactly where he had left her, arms round her knees, shoes still set neatly side by side beyond her stockinged feet, and she was looking at the mouth of the aisle as though she had been looking at it the entire time he was gone. He stopped at the edge of the light with his heart going like a fist on a door. "You could have come after me," he said. "Why on earth would I do that? People do. People who want something." She unwrapped her arms and set her palms flat on the flagstones behind her and leaned back on them, and her chin came up. "I've got everything I want. I'm sitting in a warm patch of my own light with 4 hours of work, and nobody in the building to interrupt it. You're the one who came back." "I forgot my—" He had nothing. He had brought nothing. His hands were empty and had been empty coming in, and he stood there with a sentence dying in his mouth, and saw, with a kind of appalled clarity, that he had just tried to lie about a coat. Something happened at the corner of her mouth. It got put away almost at once. "Sit down," Hermione said. "Or don't, but stop hovering in doorways. It's the single most irritating thing you do, and you've been doing it since you were 11. He sat, not across from her this time. He didn't decide to do it differently. His body simply went to the same shelf she was against, 3 feet along it, and put itself down with its back to the ledges and its legs out. The cold of the stone came up through him again. Their shoulders were not touching. There was a hand's width of nothing between his sleeve and hers, and he was aware of that nothing, the way one is aware of a held note. The lamp drifted, resettled, and threw both their shadows long down the aisle in front of them, and the shadows were exactly the same height. "Right," she said. "Say the thing you came back to say." "I don't know what I came back to say." "That's fine. That's an answer." She tipped her head against the shelf. "Say it slowly then. We've got hours." So he sat in the dark of level 9 with the woman who had just told him she would see him coming, and he talked. It came out wrong at first. Brittle, arranged, the sentences of a man giving evidence. He told her about the petition and the violet stamp and the queue building behind him at the filing counter. He told her about the 200 galleons and the bloodless language and the phrase standing not established, and heard his own voice go acid around it, and stopped and started again. Somewhere in the second hour it stopped being evidence. He told her about the morning room, about the light through the east windows in October, which came in low and yellow and lay in long panels across the carpet, and how his mother took her tea in that light every day at 11 because the warmth was good for her hands. He told her about the summons, and how she had poured, and how the amber had come down in a line that did not shake, not by a hair, not once, and how he had watched that line and understood that he was being lied to out of love and could do absolutely nothing about it. She said, "Drink it while it's hot, darling." The lamp had burned lower. The light had gone from butter to amber, and the aisle beyond it had closed in, and the whole world was 8 feet of stone floor and 2 people on it. "Say that again," Hermione said. "What?" "That." Her voice was odd. "The way you said 'darling.' You said it in her voice." He looked at her. She was very close now, closer than she had been, or he was. One of them had shifted at some point in the last hour, and neither had remarked on it. And the lamplight lay along the side of her face and caught in the loose curl at her temple where the quill still was. "Did I?" "Yes." "I've been doing that since I was 9, he said. "It infuriated my father." And Hermione Granger laughed. It was not a large sound. It was almost nothing. A breath let out on a note, a small collapse. But it went through him like a hand laid flat on his sternum. He had heard her laugh across a great hall 1,000 times at other people's jokes. He had never once caused it, and he discovered in that instant, with real horror, that he wanted to cause it again. "Malfoy." "What?" "Nothing." She was looking straight ahead, down the aisle, at the 2 long shadows. Nothing." The lamp cracked softly. The dust turned in the light. "I'll ask you a question," she said at last. "And I want you to understand that it isn't a trick, and that I'm not going to write it down or repeat it, and that you can tell me to go to hell. That's a great deal of preamble. It's a great deal of question. She turned her head. Do you actually think she did something? The cold came up through the stone and into the base of his spine, and he sat with it and did not answer for a long time. I think, he said finally, that she stood in a wood 2 years ago with a boy's heart under her hand and lied to the worst man who ever lived, and that if she had got it wrong by 1 syllable, I would be dead, and so would you, and so would everyone. He was looking at his own hands. And I think there is a file 200 feet from where we're sitting that has her name in it, and I don't know which of the things she's done is in it. That's what I can't. His jaw worked. I don't know which version of her they've got. Hermione said nothing. She won't tell me, he said. That's the whole of it. She has decided what she's going to carry, and she has decided I'm not to help carry it, and she's 61, and I am the only person left, and she pours the tea with a steady hand and calls me darling and tells me nothing. His voice had gone. He stopped and pressed the heel of his hand hard against his mouth and held it there until he could trust himself. And in the silence, Hermione moved. She did not put a hand on his arm. Later, much later, when he had had time to take the evening apart and lay the pieces out and stare at them, he would understand that she had known precisely what a hand on the arm would have done to him, and had refused to do it, and that the refusal had been the kindest thing anyone had done for him in 2 years. What she did was shift, 1 inch, maybe less, so that the nothing between her shoulder and his stopped being nothing. That was all. A single point of contact through 2 layers of wool. The pressure of a shoulder against a shoulder, steady, unmoving, not asking for anything, and not going away. He could feel the warmth of her coming through the cloth. He could feel her breathing. The lamp guttered, and neither of them touched it, and it burned lower. Afterwards, the weeks did a strange thing. They folded. He could never, later, put them back into proper order. There were only pieces, and each piece was lit like a stage. The first week, a note on his kitchen table at 8 in the morning, dropped by an owl he didn't know, 4 words in a hand that pressed hard on the downstrokes. Row 12 is empty. Nothing else. No signature. He had stood in his dressing gown with the note in both hands, understanding that she had gone and looked, had gone down there herself and checked the shelf and found the file moved, and had told him. Not the contents, the geography. She had given him the one thing she could give without breaking, and it was almost nothing, and it was everything. The 3rd week, the atrium at 6:30, sleet coming down so hard on the enchanted ceiling that the whole hall roared with it, and the fountain running, and every person in the building queuing for the flues. He had seen her from 30 feet away, standing at the edge of the crowd with a stack of folders and no coat, and he had crossed the atrium without deciding to, and put his umbrella into her hand. I'm going by flu. You're going to walk to Whitehall first, because you always do, because you can't bear the queue. He'd said it before he heard himself say it, and then he'd heard himself say it, and so had she. Something opened in her face. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. The look of someone finding a footprint in a place they'd thought was theirs alone. How do you know that? Take the umbrella, Granger. The 5th week, a cafe off Diagon with a window running with rain and her hands round a cup, and a 2-hour argument about a Wizengamot precedent from 1834 that ended with both of them leaning across the table with their sleeves in the sugar. And she had been wrong. She had been genuinely wrong about the Braithwaite ruling. And when he proved it, she had gone quiet for a moment, and then said, "Show me that again," with such naked appetite that he had had to look away at the rain. The 6th week, her hand. He had been holding a door, a proper heavy oak door in a corridor on 4, and she had gone through it, and the strap of her bag had caught the latch, and he had reached to free it, and for perhaps 2 seconds his fingers had been at her wrist, bare skin, the narrow bones of it warm, the pulse going quick under the pad of his thumb. Neither of them said anything. She had gone through the door, and he had let it close. He stood in the empty corridor afterwards with his hand still slightly curved, and the hollow report of his own footsteps did not start, because he did not move for some time. And this was the part he could not put anywhere. The plan was working. That was the plain fact of it, and every night he laid it out and looked at it, and every night it looked worse. The plan had required exactly this: proximity, ease, the manufacture of a place in her life. The plan had specified an outing, somewhere public, somewhere unguarded, somewhere with a plausible reason to put something into a person's mouth. He had chosen the place in the 1st week. He had the vial in the drawer of his writing desk under a folded handkerchief, and he took it out most evenings and set it on the wood and looked at it. 3 drops, an hour of unarmoured truth. Who named her? What's in the file? What are they going to do? And in the 6th week, he sat at the desk at 1 in the morning with the vial standing in the lamplight, and found that he could not think about the file at all. He tried. He put the questions in order in his head, the way he'd done for weeks, and every time he reached the 2nd one, his mind slid off it like a hand off wet glass and went somewhere else entirely. And where it went was this: the shoulder against my shoulder in the archive, the 2 seconds at her wrist, the way she laughed at my mother's voice. And under that, lower down, in a register he had no intention of examining. Does she think about it? Any of it? When she's alone? Does she think about the door on 4? He picked up the vial and turned it, and the clear liquid moved and gave the light nothing back. You could ask her, said something in him, in her voice, from a green-lit corridor. You could just ask. He put the vial back in the drawer, under the handkerchief, and shut it, and sat in the dark for a long time, with his hands flat on the desk. The 8th week, he wrote to her. It took 9 drafts. He burned 8 of them in the grate and watched the paper curl and go, and the 9th said, "Hogsmeade, Saturday. It will be freezing and everything will be shut, and I want you to come anyway." Her reply came in under an hour, which meant she had not thought about it, or had already thought about it a great deal. Yes, 2 o'clock. He read it 4 times. Then he stood in his kitchen with the note in his hand and the sleet coming at the window in long slants, and did the thing he had been refusing to do for 6 weeks. He made himself say it out loud in the empty room to see whether it would survive being spoken. "You are going to poison her on Saturday." The words hung there. The sleet went on against the glass. He opened the drawer, lifted the handkerchief, and took out the vial, and his knuckles, as he closed his hand around it, went white through the skin, and he stood there in the cold kitchen holding it, and did not put it back. Hermione Granger kept a ledger, not the official kind. She had 4 of those, colour-coded, and they lived on the shelf above her desk at the ministry, where anyone might read them and learn nothing. This one was a plain black notebook with a cracked spine, and it lived in the drawer of her kitchen table under a ball of twine and a spare pair of scissors, and it had begun 11 weeks ago on the Monday she had read the ward record. The first entry said, October 18th, row 12, 2 minutes 11 seconds. Drew wand did not cross. Question: what makes a man stand still that long? She sat at the table on the Friday night before Hogsmeade with a notebook open in front of her and the rest of the flat dark and a single candle burning down at her elbow, because the electric light made the whole thing feel like homework and read her own handwriting getting less certain the further down the pages it went. October 24th. Petition denied. Checked. Standing not established. Absurd. He is her son. November 2nd. Tolliver. Cardiff. A job. A wife who doesn't know. He did not gloat about it, and he did not defend it. He flinched. November 11th. Archive. He sat on the floor. He did not want to sit on the floor. He sat on the floor. Her fingertip stopped on that line. She could still put herself back there with almost no effort. The cold coming up through the flagstones, the lamp riding at her shoulder, the smell of leather and dust, and the faint sharp trace of ozone that clung to him from wherever he'd been that day. And his voice, flattening out and going wrong. She said, "Drink it while it's hot, darling. Nobody performs a mother's voice." That was the whole difficulty. Everything else he had done in 11 weeks could be read 2 ways. The umbrella, the note, the 2 seconds at her wrist. All of it explicable as craft, as the patient carpentry of a man with a purpose. She had said as much to his face in the archive, and she had meant it as a warning, and he had heard it as one. But nobody performs a mother's voice. That had come up out of somewhere under the design, from a place he wasn't managing, and it had been so unguarded that she had felt something turn over in her chest and had had to look down the aisle at the shadows to get her face in order. November 15th, the ledger said. He knows I know. He's still coming. Why? November 23rd. Atrium. Umbrella. He knew about Whitehall. Nobody knows about Whitehall. That one had frightened her. It had frightened her badly, standing in the roar of the sleet on the enchanted ceiling, with his umbrella in her hand, and his face doing something complicated above her, because it meant he had been paying the kind of attention that cannot be faked at that resolution. You can learn a woman's opinions in a week. You do not learn that she walks 15 minutes in bad weather to avoid a queue unless you have watched her leave the building more times than you would ever admit. December 1st. Cafe. Braithwaite, 1834. He was right. He was so pleased about being right that he forgot to be pleased about anything else, and for about 90 seconds he was simply a person. December 6th. The door on 4. That entry had nothing after it. She had written those 5 words and then sat with the quill above the page for a long time and put it down again without adding anything, because there was nothing to add that she was prepared to see in her own handwriting. 2 seconds. His fingers at the inside of her wrist, freeing a strap. That was all it had been. She had gone through the door and down the corridor and into her own office and shut the door and stood with her back against it, and had put her other hand over the place, and had stood there like a 4th year and had been furious with herself for a full quarter of an hour. The candle guttered. She turned the page. December 14th. Note: Hogsmeade, Saturday. And under it, in a hand that had pressed hard enough on the downstrokes to score the paper, he is going to do it on Saturday. She had known about the vials since the 2nd week. It was not a triumph of deduction. It was arithmetic, of the same brutal kind he'd done himself. She had listed the routes on the back of an envelope in October and crossed them off one by one as he burned through them, and when the 4th one was the only one left, she had simply written Veritaserum and looked at the word until it stopped being shocking, because there was nothing else. Legilimency would have required him to get inside a mind she had been defending since she was 19, and he was good, but he was not that good, and more to the point, he would have had to look at her while he did it. Imperious was Azkaban, and he had a mother to keep out of Azkaban. A bribe was Tolliver, and Tolliver had cost him something she could see him still paying. That left the vial. And a vial requires an occasion, and an occasion requires a woman who will open her mouth without thinking, and that she had understood, sitting at this same tables in the 1st week of November with the envelope in front of her, was what all of it was for. The umbrella, the note, the archive floor. She had cried about it exactly once, briefly and angrily, and then washed her face and gone to work, and then had done a thing she would have called in anyone else insane. She had kept going. The antidote was simmering on the stove behind her while she read the ledger. She had brewed it herself over 3 evenings in a copper pan she normally used for jam, because she had not wanted a purchase record in any apothecary in Britain. It was nearly done. A thin, colourless liquid with a faint mineral shine on its surface, and it smelled of nothing at all until you got your face right over the pan, and then it smelled like the inside of a cave. It was a good antidote. It was probably the best piece of potion work she had done since school, and she had done it at 10 o'clock at night in her dressing gown, with her hair pinned up with a pencil, and the pettiness of her own competence made her want to laugh. 3 drops of it, taken within the hour, and Veritaserum became water. Not a suppression, an unbinding. The compulsion simply failed to find a purchase. She would sit there with her tongue entirely her own and be able to say anything she liked, true or false, in any proportion she chose. She stirred it once, anti-clockwise, and turned the flame down, and stood at the stove with her arms folded, looking at the black window and the sleet coming across the streetlight outside in long silver slants. So don't go. That was the sane position, and she could argue it in her sleep. Don't go. Send an owl on Saturday morning saying you're unwell. Put in a discreet word with Robards, and let the man be quietly, humanely stopped before he does the thing that ends him. There was even a version where nobody's life was wrecked at all, where Draco Malfoy went home and the inquiry ran its course, and Narcissa was never charged because— and this was the joke. This was the thing that made Hermione grip the edge of the stove. Because there was nothing in the file. That was the truth of it. She had read the whole record. 3 depositions mentioned Narcissa Malfoy, and all 3 said the same thing in different words. She lied to him in the wood. She said the boy was dead. She chose her son over her master. The name was in the file the way a witness's name is in a file. There was no charge. There was never going to be a charge. The board had noted it in October and moved on. He was going to burn his life down for a piece of paper that would have exonerated her. She could end the whole thing on Saturday morning with 1 sentence. "There's nothing in it, Malfoy. She's not a defendant. Go home." And she was not going to. Hermione sat back down at the table and put her hands flat on either side of the notebook and made herself be honest, which was, she had found, the least popular activity in the world when performed alone at midnight. "Why aren't you going to?" The first answer came up fast and dressed nicely. Because he has to be stopped in a way that stops him, and a sentence in a corridor won't do it. Because if I tell him now, he will simply believe I'm managing him, and he will go on to the 5th method, whatever that is. Which was true. It was even good. And it was not the reason. The candle stooped and recovered. The reason was this. And it took her 3 attempts to get it into words even in her own head. She wanted to know what he would ask first. That was all. That was the whole of it. Because a man who has finally got a woman's truth in his hand asks for what he actually came for. Not what he says he came for, not what he has been telling himself in the small hours, but the thing underneath, the thing his mouth goes to before his judgment catches up. The first question is the only honest one anybody ever asks. Everything after it is edited. If he asked about the file, if the very first words out of him were who named her, or what's in it, or what will the board do, then she would have her answer about 11 weeks, and the umbrella, and Whitehall, and the 2 seconds at the door on 4. It would all resolve into one clean, cold shape, and she could put the notebook in the fire and be sensible for the rest of her life. And if he asked something else, Hermione picked up the quill. She dipped it. She held it above the page for a long moment, and a bead of ink gathered at the tip and fell and made a small black star on the paper, and she watched it spread into the grain. Then she wrote, in a smaller hand than she used for anything else, "I want to hear him ask." She looked at it. 6 words. 2 years of building a reputation for judgment, and a review board seat, and a locked file, and here was the actual engine of it, sitting on the page in her own handwriting like a confession slipped under a door. Because there was a version of Saturday she had not permitted herself to plan for, and could not stop constructing anyway. In that version, he leaned in over a table in some freezing, shut-up village with the light going blue outside, and the first thing he said was not about his mother at all, and she would have to answer him. That was the part that made her hand unsteady, and she set the quill down and pressed her palm flat on the table until it stopped. Because the antidote unbound the compulsion, it did not make her a liar. It gave her the choice. And she had been running that choice in her head for 2 weeks, and had not once been able to imagine herself sitting across a table from Draco Malfoy while he asked her, in that stripped voice he'd used for his mother's tea, whether she thought about him, and lying. You could tell him no, she thought. You could say no and watch his face and know everything. She would not be able to. She knew she would not be able to. And that meant that whatever else Saturday was, it was not a trap she was setting for him. It was one she was walking into with her eyes open and had brewed the antidote for, so that she could not pretend afterwards that anything she said had been forced out of her. That was the whole design. She had made herself unable to blame the potion. The stove ticked. The antidote had come off the boil and gone still, and its surface held the candle light in a thin, trembling disk. Hermione got up and took a phial from the dresser and ladled the potion in and stoppered it, and it was warm in her hand, the way water from a tap is warm, ordinary, and alive. She set it on the table beside the notebook. Then she opened the notebook again to the last page and read the 6 words, and after a moment she added 2 lines under them, and the quills scratched loudly in the quiet flat. If he asks about the phial first, that is the end of it, and I will be glad to have found out cheaply. If he doesn't... She stopped. She sat with the quill above the page and the ink drying on the nib and the sleet going against the black window, and could not finish the sentence. Not because she didn't know how it ended, but because she did. She blew out the candle, and in the dark she picked up the phial and closed her fingers round it, and the glass was still warm. Hogsmeade, in the 3rd week of December, off-season and out of term, was a village that had given up pretending. The sleet had started somewhere over the moor and come down into the valley at an angle, and it did not fall so much as travel, sideways in long grey ropes, so that the thatch on the low roofs ran black, and the cobbles held an inch of grey slush that went over the tops of your shoes if you misjudged the camber. Half the shop fronts were shuttered for the season. Gladrags had a board across its window. The 3 broomsticks was lit but nearly empty, 4 figures at the bar, and a fire that had been let go down. Draco stood at the top of the high street at 2 o'clock, with his collar up and the sleet finding the inch of skin behind his ear, and watched her come. She was walking too fast, as always, head down against the weather, one hand holding her scarf closed at the throat. She had not brought an umbrella. He had a moment, a whole ridiculous moment, standing in the slush, of being outraged about it on her behalf. Then she looked up and saw him, and something happened to her face, and he stopped being able to think about umbrellas at all. "You said everything would be shut," she said, arriving. "It is shut." "You said that as though it were a reason to come." It was a reason to come. He said it too quickly. Her scarf had got soaked at the edge, and a strand of hair was stuck flat to her cheekbone, and he wanted, with a violence that arrived out of nowhere, to move it. "Nobody's here. There's no one to see us." The instant it left his mouth, he heard how it sounded, and so did she. Her eyes came up. "Is that what this is?" she said. "Somewhere no one can see us?" "No." He was aware of the vial. It sat in the inside left pocket of his coat, against his ribs. Warm now, always warm. Warm the way it had been in the corridor outside courtroom 9. That came out wrong. Did it? "Granger, I'm only asking." And then, unaccountably, she smiled at him. A small, crooked, entirely disarming thing, with sleet on her eyelashes. "Come on, I'm freezing, and you're going white round the mouth, and there is exactly one place in this village worth being in December. Honeydukes at 2:30 on a sleeting Saturday was warm enough to make the windows weep. The shutter was half down over the door. Ambrosius Flume put it there in the off-season to keep the draught out, and you had to duck under it and come up into a wall of heat and sugar. Draco ducked. He came up into it, and the smell hit him like a hand. Burnt caramel, aniseed, hot chocolate somewhere at the back, and under all of it the flat pink smell of boiled sugar cooling on marble. The place was empty, except for the proprietor asleep in a chair by the stove with a newspaper over his face. The jars went up the walls to the ceiling, hundreds of them, tall and squat and bulbous, and the lamp on the counter threw its light through the glass, so that the whole shop was hung with slabs of coloured shadow. Green on the floorboards, a long panel of amber lying across the display case, a bar of deep red thrown up the far wall like a stripe of paint. The condensation ran on the inside of the front window in slow, crooked lines. Hermione unwound her scarf and stood in the middle of it with her face lifted, and her cheeks came up red from the cold, and she made a small sound of pure animal pleasure at the heat. Draco stood by the door and could not, for a moment, make himself move. "Now," said the part of him that had planned this, "this is the place. This is exactly the place you chose. In the first week, sitting at your desk with a map. Empty shop, sleeping proprietor, 100 reasons to put something in a person's mouth. 2 hours of daylight left. Do it." His hand had gone to the inside of his coat without his permission. He took it out again and shoved both hands in his pockets instead and went and stood beside her. "Don't tell me," she said, "that you've never been in here in December." "I've never been in here at all." She turned. "What?" "Not once. You were at that school for 6 years. I know. You had money. I had a house elf," he said, "and a mother who sent a hamper on the 1st of every month, and a father who considered the purchase of confectionery in a public shop to be a species of begging." He shrugged, one shoulder precise. "I used to wait outside, on the corner by the post office. Everyone would come out with their bags, and I'd say something unpleasant about the quality of the toffee." Hermione stared at him for so long that he began to regret every word. "That," she said at last, "is the single saddest thing you have ever told me, and you told me about your mother's tea." "It isn't sad, it's... Come here." And she took his sleeve, not his hand. His sleeve, 2 fingers and a thumb closed on the wet wool at his forearm, and she towed him 3 steps to the counter and let go, and his arm went on registering it after the contact had ended, a warm patch of pressure that outlasted its cause. "Right," she said. "Sugar quills are for children, and fizzing Whizbees are a novelty, and anyone who tells you the pepper imps are worth it is lying to be interesting." She was going along the jars with her finger not quite touching the glass. "The only genuinely good thing in this shop is on the 3rd shelf, and Flume doesn't advertise it because he only makes 40 a week." "Which is?" She stopped at a squat jar with a brass lid. Inside, on a bed of waxed paper, lay a couple of dozen lollipops the size of a large coin, dark amber, each one shot through with a thread of something paler. "Blackthorn, honey and salt," Hermione said. "He does them in October when the slows come in. They're indecent." Draco looked at the jar, and the whole room went very quiet in his ears. A lollipop. It's a lollipop. It goes in a wrapper. You take it out of the wrapper. There is nothing on God's earth easier than 3 drops on a boiled sweet. He heard himself say, in a voice that sounded entirely normal, "Then get 2. You'll hate it." "I'll hate it in an informed way." She laughed, that small collapsing sound, the one he had first caused on a cold floor 9 floors underground, and went to wake the proprietor, and Draco stood alone at the counter in a slab of amber light with the jar in front of him, and his heart going so hard he could feel it in the roof of his mouth. He had perhaps 40 seconds. He turned his back to her. He got the vial out. His hands were entirely steady, which he noted with a kind of distant horror, because it meant he had become the sort of man whose hands are steady doing this. Flume was talking now, blurred and cheerful behind him, something about the weather and the season and the slows. He heard Hermione say, "2, please," and heard the brass lid come off. The lollipops came in a twist of waxed paper. Flume put them on the counter and turned to the till, and Draco's hand went out, and 1 drop, and 2, and 3 went onto the amber disc of the nearer one and vanished, absorbed, gone in half a second into the sugar without leaving so much as a gloss. He put the vial away. He picked up both lollipops and turned round with 1 in each hand, and Hermione was counting coins into Flume's palm, and she did not look up. Outside, the light had begun to go. They walked down the high street with the sleet easing to a fine wet drift, and the sky over the moor had turned the colour of a bruise going yellow at the edges, and the lamps had come on early along the road, small and orange, 1 every 30 feet, and each one held a cone of falling wet in it, and nothing else. There was a bench outside the shuttered post office. Draco brushed the slush off it with his forearm without thinking, and they sat. For a while, neither of them said anything. The village made its small noises, water running off a gutter, a door somewhere, the wind coming down off the hill and going through the elms behind the church with a long sound like a held breath. "I have to tell you something," Hermione said. His stomach dropped through the bench. "Do you?" Row 12. She had her hands pushed into her sleeves. She was looking straight ahead down the road. "You never asked me what I found when I went and looked. You said it was empty." "It's empty because the file's been in the Chief Warlock's chambers since the 11th of November, she said. "Which means it's not in general circulation, which means the board can't call it, which means whatever's in it isn't going anywhere before the spring session at the earliest." She glanced sideways. "I'm telling you that so you can sleep. I've been meaning to tell you for a month, and I kept not doing it, and I don't entirely know why." Draco sat with the 2 lollipops in his hand, and the world went strange around him. She had given him something, not the file, a piece of it, a real piece, the shape of the ground, and she had given it away on a bench in a wet village for no reason at all, except that she had wanted him to sleep. Get up, he thought. Get up and throw them both in the gutter and walk her to the station. "Malfoy?" "Yes." "You've gone completely white." "It's the cold." "It isn't the cold." She turned properly towards him on the bench, and one knee came up onto the seat, and she was close now, close enough that he could see the sleet melting in her hair. "You do this. You go somewhere. In the archive you did it, and at the cafe you did it, and I never know whether to follow you or leave you alone. Don't follow me. That isn't an option I was offering. The lamp above them buzzed faintly. Behind the church, the wind went through the elms again, and Draco Malfoy, who had planned this moment on graph paper in the first week of November, heard himself say, lightly, with a mouth that seemed to belong to someone else, "Hold out your hand." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because I've just spent 11 sickles on something indecent, and I want to see your face." Something flickered across her expression. It was gone before he could name it, and he was not, in that moment, looking hard enough to try. She held out her hand. He put nothing in it. "No," he said. "Close your eyes." The wind dropped. The whole street went briefly, absolutely still, and the rain on the cobbles was the only sound in the world. Hermione's mouth curved. "Close my eyes," she repeated, "and open your mouth." He said it as a joke. He would have sworn afterwards that he had said it as a joke, that his voice had gone lazy and light and mocking on purpose, that it had been armor and not appetite. But it came out low and slow and much too quiet, and the moment it was out, he could not take it back and did not want to. And something happened in the 6 inches of wet air between them that had nothing to do with sugar. She held his eyes for a beat longer than was bearable. Then, still smiling, she closed them, and she tipped her chin up, and her lashes lay dark against her cold flushed cheek, and her lips parted, and Draco's whole body went to a fine trembling stillness, and he unwrapped the waxed paper with fingers that had stopped being steady at last, and the paper crackled loud as fire in the quiet. He put the amber disc on her tongue. The pad of his thumb brushed her lower lip going in. A half second, nothing, less than the wrist at the door on 4, and he felt her breath go out warm across his knuckle, and he did not take his hand away as fast as he should have. Her mouth closed. She kept her eyes shut for a moment longer. He watched her tongue move behind her lips, watched the small frown of concentration, watched her taste it. "Now," said something in him, very far off. "Ask her now." But her eyes opened and she was looking straight at him from 4 inches away, with the lamplight caught in them. And the first question in his head was not about a file, and had not been about a file for 6 weeks, and he opened his mouth to say something else entirely, and could not get it out for a full 3 seconds. "Well," Hermione said, around the suite. "Ask me. Ask me." 2 words, and they went through him like a wire pulled tight. Draco sat back an inch on the wet bench, and the movement was involuntary, the body of a man stepping away from an edge, and the waxed paper was still crushed in his left hand, and he did not know what to do with it, and so he did nothing with it at all. She was watching him. That was the thing he had not accounted for in 11 weeks of planning. He had imagined the potion doing its work on a woman who was looking somewhere else, at a menu, at a window, at the rain. He had not imagined her sitting 4 inches away with her knee up on the bench and her eyes wide open, waiting as though this were a conversation. His mouth was dry. He got the question up out of his chest, and it came out as nothing like the question he had prepared. "Do you think about me?" The wind moved in the elms behind the church. He heard it, heard himself, heard the 6 words hanging in the wet air with the lamp buzzing over them, and a kind of cold clarity opened in him. That's it then. That's what you came for. 11 weeks and a bribed clerk in Cardiff and a ward line at 11 at night and his mother's steady hand on the teapot. And the first thing out of him was, "Do you think about me?" like a boy passing a note. He waited for the shame. It did not arrive. What arrived instead was worse. A terrible, attentive hunger, his whole body angled forward to hear. Hermione took the sweet from her mouth. She held it between finger and thumb, amber and wet, and looked at it for a moment, and then at him. "Yes," she said. The lamp buzzed. "When?" "That isn't a fair question. It's the only one I've got. It's a greedy one." But her voice had gone lower, and she was not looking away. "When I'm walking to Whitehall, which you ruined, incidentally. I used to walk it and think about work, and now I walk it and think about a man handing me an umbrella like it was an accusation." She turned the lollipop slowly. "When I'm in the archive. Every single time I'm in the archive, and I'm in the archive 4 days a week, and there's a place on the floor by row 9 where nobody sits, and I look at it." Something in his chest lurched hard enough to hurt. "You said it wasn't a fair question." "It isn't." She looked up at him, and there was colour high on her cheekbones that had not been the cold. "I answered it anyway." "Because you have no choice," he thought, and the thought was so obscene that he flinched from it physically, his shoulder going back against the bench. He had done this. She was sitting in the wet with her tongue unbound and telling him about a patch of floor she looked at, and he had done it to her, and every word coming out of her was going into him like something poured into a vessel that had been dry for 2 years. "Stop. Stand up. Tell her." "That night in the archive," he said instead. "When I came back, what did you feel?" "Relief." The word came out flat and fast and unadorned, and it undid him more thoroughly than anything elaborate could have. "Relief," he repeated. "I'd spent 40 minutes deciding I wasn't going to go after you," Hermione said, "and about 9 of those minutes were spent arguing that I didn't want to, and I lost that argument at minute 4 and spent the other 5 losing it again." Her jaw tightened. She pressed on. "And then you came back up the aisle looking like you'd been running and lied about a coat you never had. And I thought, oh no. Oh no. Yes, oh no, Malfoy. What do you imagine a sensible woman thinks when she catches herself being glad about you?" He laughed. It came out of him raw and surprised, and it echoed off the shuttered post office behind them, and she stared at him with her lips slightly parted, and then something in her face broke open, and she laughed too. It lasted 3 seconds. When it stopped, the silence afterwards was much worse than the one before, because now they were both leaning in. The sleet had thinned to a fine cold drift. It came slanting through the lamp's cone of light and settled on the shoulders of his coat and did not melt. "The shoulder," he said. "What?" "On the floor. You moved. You put your shoulder against mine, and you didn't say anything, and you didn't take it away for—" His voice caught somewhere, and he had to go round it. "For an hour. Why did you do that instead of putting your hand on my arm?" Hermione's eyes went bright. "Because you'd have got up and left," she said. "A hand on the arm is pity, and you'd have felt it coming, and you'd have been out of that aisle in 4 seconds, and I'd never have got you back down there again. A shoulder isn't pity. A shoulder's just... She made a small, helpless motion with the hand holding the lollipop. Company. It's the only thing I could think of that you'd be able to accept. He could not speak. He sat on a wet bench outside a shuttered post office in a dead village, and could not speak, because a woman had just told him that she had spent an hour on a cold stone floor performing a piece of precision engineering on his pride, so that he would let himself be comforted, and had never mentioned it, and had never intended to mention it. "How long?" he said, and stopped and started again. "How long have you known that about me?" "Since about the 3rd week of October. That's 4 days after the ward record." "Yes." "You built a Granger. That's a study." "Don't say it like that." "How am I meant to say it?" "Not like an accusation." Her chin came up. "I read a report that said a man stood outside a locked shelf for 2 minutes and 11 seconds and didn't cross the line, and I could not stop thinking about it. And I have never in my life been able to leave a thing alone once I've started, and that is not a crime." The lamp above them stuttered, dimmed, came back. "What did you write down?" he said. "Malfoy." "You wrote it down. Of course you wrote it down. What did you write?" And there, for the first time, he saw her fight it. Her hand went to the cuff of her coat sleeve. It turned it once, quickly, and smoothed it flat against her wrist, though it had been flat already, and then did it a second time, and she noticed herself doing it, and made herself stop and put the hand in her lap. "What makes a man stand still that long?" she said. Draco found he was leaning forward with both forearms on his knees, the crushed waxed paper still in one fist. "That's what you wrote?" "That's what I wrote." "And what," he said very quietly, "did you decide the answer was?" Hermione looked at him for a long moment in the failing light. "That he was afraid of what he'd become if he crossed it," she said, "and that a man who's afraid of that is not the man in the file." Afterwards, he could not reconstruct the order of the next quarter of an hour. It came apart into pieces, the way the 8 weeks had, and each piece was lit like a stage. "Do you ever wish I'd been someone else?" "No. That's the appalling part. I've tried. I've had entire conversations with myself where I construct a version of you with a different name and no history, and it's boring, and I resent it, and I come back. When I touched your wrist at the door on 4, her eyes closing briefly, I went into my office and shut the door and stood against it with my hand over the place like a 4th year, and I was so angry with myself I couldn't work for the rest of the afternoon. Would you have let me kiss you? In the cafe. When I was right about Braithwaite and you looked at me like that. A pause, longer than the others, the sleet drifting through the lamplight. Yes. He sat with that. You'd have let me. I'd have wanted you to, Hermione said, which isn't the same thing, and I want to be exact about it, because I've been exact about everything else, and I'm not going to start being coy in the last 5 minutes. His pulse was going in his throat, at the wrists, in the soft place under the jaw. Do you hate me? No. You did. I did. Her voice had gone very quiet. I hated you for 6 years, and it was the cleanest feeling I ever had, and I miss it, because everything since has been... She stopped. Her mouth worked. Has been like standing in a doorway in a draft. Granger! What? Ask me something. She blinked. What? Anything. He was aware that his voice had changed, that it had gone somewhere he had no control over. It isn't fair. This isn't. You're sitting there being torn open, and I'm asking questions like a man behind a desk. Ask me something, and I'll answer it. I swear on anything you like, I'll answer it exactly. Something moved through Hermione's face that he could not read at all. A flicker of something like grief. All right, she said. Why did you come back? In the archive, when you got to the lift. He did not even have to look for the answer. It was standing right there, as it had been standing there for 6 weeks, in the room he never went into. Because you hadn't followed me, he said. And I got to the grill and put my hand out and realized I was listening for your footsteps and they weren't coming. And there was a sound in that corridor. You know the sound, the way it comes back off the stone. And it was only mine. And I thought, if I get in this lift, I will spend the rest of my life in corridors where the only footsteps are mine, and that is exactly what I deserve. And I found I could not do it. The lamp buzzed. Hermione's eyes had filled. That's a very good answer, she said unsteadily. Is it true? That's my line. Is it true? Yes, he said. And then he looked at her, properly, for the first time in 10 minutes, at her actual face, rather than at the shape of the answer he was waiting for, and saw the tears standing in her eyes and the sweet held forgotten in her fingers, going soft in the wet, and the whole architecture of the afternoon came apart in his hands. She can't stop. The thought arrived fully formed and freezing. She cannot stop. You have taken her tongue out of her own keeping, and she is sitting here handing you the inside of her chest, and she has no more choice about it than a tap has about water. And you have been sitting here for a quarter of an hour drinking it. Every single thing she had said, the patch of floor, the door on 4, I'd have wanted you to. Every one of them turned over in the same instant and showed him its other face. Not gifts, extractions. He had not asked one question about the file. He had not thought about the file. He had used the worst thing he had ever done in his life to ask a woman whether she thought about him on her way to work. And she had answered because she could not do otherwise. And he had enjoyed it. Draco moved. It was not a decision. His hand came up and closed on her wrist. The same wrist, the narrow bones of it, the pulse going quick and hard under his thumb. And the waxed paper fell out of his other fist into the slush. Spit it out, he said. Hermione's eyes went wide. What? Spit it out. His voice had broken clean in half. His fingers were tight enough on her wrist that he made himself loosen them and could not let go. Granger, the sweet, get it out of your mouth. Get it out now. Put it in my hand. Malfoy. Now. He was shaking. He could hear the sleet on the shutters and his own breath coming wrong. There's Veritaserum in it. 3 drops. I put it in at the counter while Flume was at the till, and you have been sitting here for 15 minutes, telling me, God, you've been telling me. And then he stopped. Because Hermione Granger had not pulled her hand away. She was sitting very still under his grip with the ruined lollipop in her fingers. And she was not shocked, and she was not frightened, and she was not scrambling backwards off the bench into the wet street. She was looking at him with her eyes brimming and her mouth trembling somewhere between fury and something else entirely. And she said, in a voice so quiet it barely carried over the rain, "I know." Part 7. I know. 2 syllables. They went into him and did not stop. Draco's hand was still closed round her wrist. He could feel the pulse under his thumb. Quick, but not the frantic quick of a woman who has just learned she has been poisoned. Steady, quick. The pulse of somebody who's been braced for a long time. "What?" "I know," Hermione said again. "I have known since the 2nd week of November." The sleet came slanting through the lamplight and settled on her hair and did not melt. And behind the church, the wind went through the elms with that long sound like a breath held and let go. And Draco sat on a wet bench with his hand round her wrist and could not make the world hold still. "That's not possible. It's arithmetic." Her voice was not gentle. It was not cruel either. It was the flat, exact voice she used across a table when she was about to be right about something. "You'd burned the petition. You'd burned Tolliver. You stood at the ward line and couldn't cross it. I read the record. I told you, I read the record. That's 3 doors shut. There is exactly 1 method left after that, and every single person who has ever run out of options in the entire history of this country has arrived at the same one." Her chin lifted. "I wrote the word on the back of an envelope in October, and I looked at it until it stopped being shocking." He let go of her wrist. He did it as though the skin had turned hot, and his hand went back to his own knee and stayed there, open, useless. "Then you—" His mouth had gone entirely dry. "You knew when I sent the note. About Hogsmeade." "Yes." "You knew walking up the high street." "Yes." "You knew when you told me to buy 2. Malfoy." Her eyes were still bright and the water in them had not fallen. "I brewed the antidote myself. 3 evenings, in a jam pan in my dressing gown. I didn't buy it because I didn't want a record in any apothecary in Britain, and I took it at 12:30, and I sat on my kitchen table afterwards and watched the clock for 90 minutes to be certain it had taken." The bottom of his stomach opened up and everything fell through it. "Then it didn't work," he said. "None of it worked. Everything you said, everything I said was true. The rain on the shutters, the buzz of the lamp, somewhere down the high street, a gutter running." "Every word," Hermione said. "The archive floor, Whitehall, the door on 4, the cafe." Her voice cracked once, halfway through, and she pushed straight on through the crack the way she went through everything. "I could have lied to you about any of it. That's what an antidote does. It doesn't seal your mouth. It gives you back the choice. I sat there with my tongue entirely my own, and I chose to tell you the truth, and I did it on a wet bench in a dead village, out loud, to a man who thought he was drugging me." Draco got up off the bench. He did not plan to. His body simply removed itself 3 paces out into the slush of the road and stood there in the falling wet with its back to her, and his hands went into his hair and stayed there. She let me. That was the shape of it. That was the thing sitting in the middle of the street with him. She had let him. She had stood at the counter in Honeydukes and asked Flume for 2 and turned her back so he could do it. She had walked down the high street beside him, knowing what was in his coat. She had closed her eyes and tipped her chin up and opened her mouth. and he had put his thumb against her lower lip and felt her breath go out warm across his knuckle, and she had let him. "Why?" He heard how it came out. Not loud. Worse than loud. "Turn round," Hermione said. "Why?" "Draco, turn round and ask me properly." He turned. The sleet was coming into his face, and he did not feel it. She was on her feet now too, at the edge of the lamp's cone, and the ruined lollipop was still in her hand, going soft and misshapen in the wet, and she had not thought to throw it away. "Because I wanted to know what you'd ask first," she said. The elms moved. "That's it," she said. "That's the whole reason, and it's uglier than yours, and I have had 2 weeks to make it sound better, and I can't. A person's first question is the only honest one they ever ask. Everything after it is edited. So I thought, if he has finally got what he spent 11 weeks building towards, if he genuinely believes my tongue is in his hand, and I cannot lie to him, the first thing out of his mouth will be what he actually came for. And if it was the file, then I'd have had my answer cheaply," Hermione said, "and I'd have gone home and put my notebook in the fire and been sensible for the rest of my life." "And it wasn't the file?" "No." Her voice went almost to nothing. "It wasn't the file." He stood in the road with the water going over the tops of his shoes and understood, slowly and then all at once, what she had actually done. She had built him a room with 2 doors and stood in it and waited to see which one he came through. And he had come through the wrong one, the one that condemned him utterly as a man and acquitted him entirely as a heart. And she had been standing there when he did it, entirely undrugged, entirely in her right mind, and had answered him. "You should be screaming at me," he said. "I've been screaming at you since October, silently, constantly." "Granger. No, I'd like to do this bit properly." She came forward 2 steps into the rain. "You are not going to get the version where I'm gracious about it. I want you to understand exactly what you did, because you keep looking at me like a man waiting for absolution, and I haven't got any, and I wouldn't give it to you if I did." He said nothing. He stood and took it. "You stood at that counter," Hermione said, "with a sleeping old man 10 feet away and a shop full of children's sweets, and you took a bottle out of your coat and your hands did not shake. I know they didn't. I've watched your hands for 11 weeks, and you tipped 3 drops onto a thing that was going into my mouth." Her breath came unevenly. "That is not a bad plan. That is a bad act. And the fact that it failed, and the fact that it failed because I was cleverer than you, does not make it into something else. If I had been 1 degree less suspicious, I would have sat on that bench and been emptied out like a drawer, and I would never, ever have known." "I know." "Do you?" "Because I don't think you do. I think you've spent 11 weeks calling it the mechanics." She threw it at him and it landed. "That's your word, Malfoy. In the archive. I've thought about the mechanics, and I said that isn't what I asked, and you didn't hear me, and you have gone on not hearing me for 2 months." The lamp above the post office stuttered and dimmed. "And the worst of it," she said, and her voice finally went, "the absolute worst of it is that there is nothing in the file." Draco's head came up. "What?" "There is nothing in it." She was crying now, properly, furiously, and making no attempt to do anything about it. 3 depositions mention your mother, and all 3 say the same thing. She lied to him in the wood. She said the boy was dead. She chose her son. That's it. That's all of it. There is no charge, and there was never going to be a charge, and the board noted it in October and moved on to the next item on the agenda. The street tilted. You knew that, he said. In November. You've known that since before you ever sat on that floor. Yes. Then why, in the name of... His voice broke apart. Granger, why didn't you tell me? I have not slept. I have not slept properly since the 11th of October. I've stood in my own kitchen at 1 in the morning, looking at that bottle like a... Because you wouldn't have believed me. It rang off the shutters. Somewhere up the street, a light came on in an upper window and went off again. You'd have thought I was managing you, Hermione said, lower, wrecked. You'd have thought it was the review board being clever, or Granger being kind, or a trap, or a bribe. And you'd have gone away and found a fifth method, and God only knows what the fifth method is, because I couldn't think of one, and I tried. And that's the excuse, and it's a good excuse, and it's not the reason. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. The reason is that I'm not better than you. I wanted to know what you'd ask. I wanted it badly enough to sit down on that bench and let you do it. So don't stand there in the road looking like the only guilty person in this village, because you're not, and it's insufferable. The rain came down between them. Draco stood in it for a long moment with his hands loose at his sides. Then, quite deliberately, he reached into his coat. He took out the vial and held it up in the lamplight. There were perhaps 6 drops left in it. The liquid moved and gave the light nothing back. No colour, no shadow, no answer. Watch this, he said. He turned it over. The remainder went out into the slush at the edge of the road, and the wet cobbles took it, and it was gone in half a second the way it had gone into the sugar. Then he set the empty vial down on the arm of the bench very precisely and stepped back from it. That's not an apology, he said. No, I haven't got one. I've been trying to build one since you said I know, and there's nothing there. Every sentence I start is about me. His jaw worked. So, I'm not going to insult you with it. Hermione stood with the ruined sweet in her fist and looked at him. What are you going to do? I don't know yet. That's not good enough. I'm aware. Then think of something, she said, because I have spent 11 weeks in a doorway in a draft, and I am not standing in it for a 12th. The wind came down off the hill. The lamp guttered, took, held. And Draco Malfoy did the only thing he could think of that was not a word. He came forward, 3 long strides through the slush, close enough that she had to look up, close enough that he could see the sleet melting at her temple and the wet gone dark on the shoulders of her coat. And he lifted his hand very slowly, giving her all the time in the world to step away, and she did not step away. He did not touch her face. He took the ruined lollipop out of her fist. That was all. He worked her fingers open with his own, gently, one at a time, and took the soft, misshapen thing out of her hand and closed his own hand round it and put it in his pocket, wet and all, and let her hand go. You've been holding it for 20 minutes, he said. Hermione made a sound that was not a laugh and not a sob. Draco, not tonight. His voice was low and unsteady and entirely bare. I'm going to do a thing, and it's going to take me 11 days, and I'm not going to tell you what it is, because if I tell you, then you'll have chosen it for me, and it has to be mine. He was already stepping back into the rain. The 11th of January. The Wizengamot sits at 10. That's the inquiry. Yes. Malfoy, what are you? Be in the gallery, he said, and turned and walked away down the high street through the falling wet with his collar up and his hands in his pockets, and the hollow report of his own footsteps coming back at him off the shuttered fronts, and got 15 paces before he stopped and stood there with his back to her in the orange cone of the next lamp, and did not turn round, and said, loudly enough to carry over the rain, "The floor by row 9. I look at it too." Courtroom 9 on the 11th of January was 3/4 full, which, for a Tuesday morning inquiry into a family nobody had liked in 20 years, was very nearly a scandal in itself. Hermione was in the gallery by 9:30. She had told herself, getting dressed in the dark at 7, that she would sit at the back on the aisle where she could leave. She had then walked into the chamber and gone straight down to the second row of the public benches, front and centre, where the rail was, where anyone standing in the well of the court would be able to see her without lifting his eyes, and had sat down and folded her hands and thought, well, so much for that. The room filled slowly. The green lamps burned in their brackets down the walls and did the same unkind work they always did, and the air had that ministry basement smell of cold stone and lamp oil, and, under it, the faint dry tooth of the parchment stacked in bales on the clerk's table. Somebody 2 rows behind her was eating something out of a paper bag. Somebody else had brought their knitting. At 3 minutes to 10, the doors at the back of the well opened and Draco came in. He was alone. That was the first thing the chamber noticed, and she felt it go through the benches around her like a change in pressure. The small collective shift of 200 people registering that the Malfoy boy had walked into an inquiry into his own family without counsel, without his mother, without so much as a clerk to carry a folder. He had no folder. He had nothing in his hands at all. He was wearing black, and he had had his hair cut, and he looked, Hermione thought with a lurch under her ribs, like a man who had not eaten properly in 11 days. He crossed the well to the witness chair and sat down in it and put his hands flat on his knees, and did not look up at the gallery, and did not look at her, and she understood that this was deliberate and that it was costing him. The chief warlock came in. The chamber stood and sat. "This inquiry is convened," said the clerk, in the flat sing-song of a man who had said it 4,000 times. "In the matter of the estate and associates of the House of Malfoy, the board will hear submissions. Are there submissions?" There was the usual shuffle. A woman from the Office of Recovery stood and said something about asset schedules. A man in a bad wig said something about the Belgian holdings. The knitting behind Hermione clicked steadily, and then, into a lull that was not really a lull, but only the moment before the next item, a voice from the well said, "Yes." The room turned. Draco had stood up. "Name," said the clerk, more from reflex than anything. "Draco Lucius Malfoy." "You are not. Mr. Malfoy, you're not summoned. You've no standing before this board. You were refused in October." "I'm aware. I'm not asking for standing." His voice carried perfectly. He had not raised it. "I'm offering testimony." A murmur went along the benches. The chief warlock leaned forward, an old man, Pemberton, with a face like a folded map, and looked down over the rail at him with frank curiosity. "Testimony as to what, precisely?" As to everything the board has been unable to establish for 2 years, Draco said. The movement of the Belgian assets in the winter of '97. The 3 vault transfers my father made through Dorset in the spring. The names of the 4 men who used my house between January and May, 2 of whom are currently drawing ministry pensions. He paused. And my own conduct throughout, in full. The chamber went completely silent. Even the knitting stopped. Mr. Malfoy, Pemberton's voice had changed. You understand that testimony offered voluntarily before this board is taken on the record? Yes. And that it may be used in proceedings against you? Yes. Have you had advice? No. Why not? Draco's hands were at his sides. From the second row, Hermione could see the knuckles standing out white through the skin, and then, very deliberately, the fingers uncurling one at a time. Because advice would have talked me out of it, he said. Pemberton sat back. There was a long moment in which the whole apparatus of the court simply stalled. The clerks looking at each other, the woman from recovery half out of her seat, a junior at the end of the bench flicking desperately through a procedural volume. And then the chief warlock said mildly, "Very well, the board will hear the witness. Swear him." And Draco said, "Not like that." Hermione's hands closed on the rail in front of her. "I beg your pardon?" "An oath is a promise," Draco said. "This board has had promises from my family for 200 years, and every one of them was worth exactly what it cost to make. I'm not asking you to take my word." He reached into his coat, and the 2 auras at the door came off the wall by 6 inches, and he saw it and stopped, and slowly turned his hand palm up. There was a small, clear vial in it. "I'd like to be examined under veritaserum," he said, "with no antidote on the record for as long as the board requires." The chamber erupted. Not loudly. It was a Wizengamot chamber, and the noise a Wizengamot chamber makes when it erupts is a sort of dense, appalled rustle, 200 people, all turning to the person beside them at once. The clerk was on his feet. Someone in the 3rd row of the gallery said, quite audibly, "He's mad." Hermione did not move. She sat with her hands on the rail and the green light on her face, and could not breathe properly, because she had spent 11 days constructing about 40 different versions of what he might do, and not one of them had been this. And because she was the only person in that entire room who knew exactly what that vial was, and where it had been bought, and what it had been bought for. "You absolute idiot," she thought, and her eyes were burning. "You beautiful, ruinous idiot." "Mr. Malfoy." Pemberton had to raise his voice over the rustle, and then again. "Mr. Malfoy, this board does not administer veritaserum to voluntary witnesses. It is reserved for the convicted and the compelled." "Yes." Draco's chin came up. "I've read the protocol. It says may not be administered against the will of a witness. It does not say may not be administered at his request, because in 200 years no one has ever requested it, because no one has ever needed to be believed this badly. And why do you need to be believed?" The question dropped into the room like a stone into a well. Draco stood in the well of courtroom 9 with a vial in his open hand, and, for the first time that morning, lifted his eyes to the public gallery. He found her instantly. He had known where she was the whole time. "Because I tried to get the truth out of somebody by force," he said. The chamber stilled. "Not here. Not from this board. From a person." He did not look away from the second row. "I spent 11 weeks planning it. I had every reason a man ever has. My mother's name is in your file, and she wouldn't tell me what was in it, and she is 61 years old, and I am the only one left. And I want it on the record that none of those reasons is a defense, because I've tried each of them out in my own kitchen at 1 in the morning, and not one of them holds." Somebody at the clerk's table had started writing very fast. "She was cleverer than me," Draco said. "It failed. It failed entirely, and it failed because of her, and not because of anything in me, and I want that on the record too." His voice did not shake. That was the extraordinary thing. Hermione watched his hands, and they were not steady, but his voice did not shake once. "And when it failed, I discovered something, which is that I had never once in 11 weeks asked myself what it would be like to be the person on the other side of it. To be sat down and opened up. To have every private thing you own come out of your own mouth in a public place, while somebody who says they care for you sits and watches." He looked back at the bench. "So, I'd like to find out," he said. "Here, where it's recorded and permanent and read by anyone who asks for it in the next 400 years. That seems to me approximately proportionate." Pemberton was silent for a long moment. "That is not," he said at last, "how this court is accustomed to receiving remorse." "No," Draco agreed, "but it's the only currency I've got that can't be counterfeited." They took 20 minutes to argue about it. Hermione sat through every second with the rail cutting into her palms. She heard perhaps a third of what was said. She heard the woman from recovery object on procedural grounds and be overruled. She heard a healer summoned to attest to fitness. She heard a clerk read the protocol aloud twice with increasing bewilderment. And underneath all of it, she heard over and over in his voice from a wet bench in December, "I'm going to do a thing, and it's going to take me 11 days. The healer came. Draco sat down in the witness chair and tipped his head back and opened his mouth. 3 drops. Hermione watched the small, clear beads fall and thought, with a savagery that surprised her, "That's what it looks like. That's what I would have looked like." And then the questions began, and they went on for 4 hours and 11 minutes. They asked him about the Belgian assets, and he gave them the account numbers from memory. They asked him about the vault transfers, and he gave them dates, sums, and the name of the goblin who had processed 2 of them. They asked him about the men who had used the manor, and he named all 4, including the 2 with the pensions, and one of those names went through the press bench like a hex, and 3 reporters left the chamber at a run. And then, somewhere in the 3rd hour, when the useful part was done and the board could have stopped, a young witch on the far left of the bench, Prewitz Jr., ambitious, bored, leaned into her microphone and said, "Mr. Malfoy, on the night of the 2nd of May, where were you when the castle fell?" The chamber went very quiet. There was no reason to ask it. It was in no schedule and served no inquiry. Pemberton's mouth opened to strike it out, and Draco said, "In the 7th floor corridor, with 2 boys I had known since I was 11. I had a wand in my hand that wasn't mine, and I did not know which way to point it, and I have never in my life been so useless, and one of them died about 90 seconds later, and I have thought about it every single day since. His hands had gone white on the arms of the chair. I was going to say something better than that. I've had 2 years to prepare something better than that. It turns out, under this stuff, you only get what's actually there. Nobody in the gallery moved. Hermione had her hand over her mouth. "Strike that exchange," Pemberton said quietly. "It has no bearing. Mr. Malfoy, the board thanks you. We'll rise." He came out of the side door into the corridor at 3:10, and the corridor was the same one. The green lamps, the cold stone, the place she had walked past him in October with folders against her hip. And he was grey to the lips, and his hands were shaking properly now that there was nobody left to see them. Hermione was standing against the wall where he had stood. He stopped 4 feet away. "Don't," he said. "Not yet. It hasn't worn off. I've got another 40 minutes, and if you ask me anything at all right now, you will get all of it, and you will get it whether you want it or not. And I have just spent 4 hours learning precisely what that does to a person." Hermione took 1 step forward. "Then don't answer," she said. "Just stand there." And she closed the distance and put her arms round him. And he made a sound against her shoulder that had nothing dignified in it whatsoever. And his hands came up slowly and fisted in the back of her coat, and they stood in the empty, green-lit corridor, holding onto each other while the last of the potion burned out of him. And 40 minutes later, when he could finally trust his own mouth again, the first thing he said was not a confession or an apology at all. "You're wearing the wrong coat." Hermione, who had spent 40 minutes standing in a freezing corridor with her arms round a shaking man and had prepared herself for absolutely anything, pulled back an inch and stared at him. "I'm... what?" "The grey one. It's not lined." Draco's voice was hoarse and entirely his own again, and his eyes had come back into focus, and he was looking down at her shoulder with an expression of genuine grievance. "It's January. It's 4 degrees in this building and 11 below on the street, and you've come out in a coat with no lining, and I have been thinking about it for 4 hours while a woman from recovery asked me about vault schedules." "You were under veritaserum?" "Yes." "For 4 hours?" "Yes." "And that's what you were thinking about?" "Apparently," he said. "That is what I was thinking about." And Hermione Granger stood in the corridor outside courtroom 9 and laughed until she had to put her hand over her mouth, and then found that the laughing had turned into something else halfway through, and that she was crying, and he watched her do it with an expression of such raw, helpless attention that she had to turn her face into his shoulder again to escape it. "Don't," she said, muffled. "Don't look at me like that. I can't help it. It hasn't fully... I know. She pressed her forehead against the wall. 40 more minutes, and you'll be a normal, awful person again. 31. You've been counting? Obsessively. The trouble began 3 days later, and it was not the trouble anyone had expected. The prophet ran the pension names on the Wednesday, and forgot about Draco entirely by Friday, because 2 sitting ministry officials being escorted out of the atrium is a better photograph than a young man in a witness chair. The board issued its interim finding on the following Tuesday. No charge to be preferred against Narcissa Black Malfoy, the record noted as exculpatory, the file unsealed and made available. Draco read the notice in his own kitchen at 7 in the morning and did not feel anything at all for about 90 seconds. Then he sat down on the floor with his back against the cupboard in his dressing gown with the parchment in both hands and stayed there until the tea went cold on the counter above him. He went to see his mother that afternoon. He did not tell her about the vial, or honeydukes, or the bench. He told her he had testified and what he had said, and Narcissa listened with her hands folded, and at the end of it she was quiet for a long time. You gave them the Dorset transfers. Yes. Your father will never forgive you. I know. Good, said Narcissa Malfoy. And then she poured the tea, and the amber came down in a line that shook badly and slopped over the rim into the saucer. And she set the pot down and pressed both hands flat on the table, and Draco reached across and put his hand over hers, and neither of them said anything at all for a while. The trouble, as it happened, was Hermione, because she would not see him. Not out of anger. She wrote twice, and both notes were kind, and both said the same thing in different words. Not yet. And he understood it, or thought he did, and made himself sit with it, and did not send flowers, because flowers would have been a form of pressure, and he had done enough of that. It went on for 5 weeks. He filled them with work he had been putting off for 2 years. He wrote to Tolliver in Cardiff, 9 drafts, 8 in the grate, and enclosed no money, because money would have been the easy thing, and instead enclosed a letter of recommendation to a records house in Bristol, signed with his own name, which was worth either everything or nothing, depending on who read it. Tolliver wrote back in March with a single line. Got the job. Didn't need the letter. Kept it anyway. He went down to level 9 twice and stood at the mouth of the aisle and looked at the patch of floor by row 9 and did not sit down. And then, on the 4th of February, he came home at 8 in the evening to find a note on his kitchen table, dropped by an owl he didn't know, in a hand that pressed hard on the downstrokes. My flat, Saturday, 7 o'clock, bring nothing. It was snowing. Not the sleet of December. Proper snow, the fat, slow kind that comes down without wind and takes all the sound out of a city, so that walking through Islington at 7 o'clock was like walking through a house where everyone was asleep. It gathered on the railings and the tops of the parked cars and the shoulders of his coat, and when he stopped outside her door, he stood for a moment and let it, because he had arrived 11 minutes early and would rather have frozen than knocked 11 minutes early. She opened the door before he touched it. You've been standing out there for 4 minutes. I have not. I watched you from the window. She had her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her hair pinned up with what appeared to be a pencil. And behind her, the flat was warm and small and disgracefully full of books. And there was a fire going in a proper grate, and the whole place smelled of wood smoke and something with rosemary in it. Draco came in and stood on the mat and did not know what to do with his hands. Give me your coat. He gave her his coat. She hung it on the hook and turned and looked at him, and the silence stretched out, and neither of them filled it. The fire shifted in the grate. Snow went past the black window in slow diagonals. 5 weeks, he said. I know. I'm not asking for an explanation. I'm stating a fact about the calendar. You are absolutely asking for an explanation. She folded her arms. Sit down. Not on the floor. I've got chairs. We're not doing that again. He sat. She did not. I needed to know, Hermione said, whether I wanted you or whether I wanted the story. That's the plainest way I can put it. Because I'd spent 11 weeks with a notebook, working you out, and then a bench in Hogsmeade, and then 4 hours in a gallery watching you do the single most reckless, honourable thing I have ever seen a human being do. And all of that is narrative, Draco. All of it is enormously exciting, and I have been suspicious of my own excitement since I was 19 years old. And nothing happened for 5 weeks, she said. That was the test. Nothing happened. You didn't send anything. There was no crisis, no file, no inquiry, nothing to solve. And I went to work and came home and made supper and thought about you constantly in the most boring possible way, about whether you were eating and whether your mother's hands were bad in the cold. And by about the 3rd week, I was so tired of it that I stopped arguing. The fire cracked. That's the least romantic speech I've ever heard. It's the most romantic speech you will ever hear, Hermione said. And you know it, and if you say otherwise, I shall throw you out into the snow. She fed him. That, too, was not what he had expected. An actual supper at an actual table with a burnt edge on the potatoes that she was defensive about. And they argued about the Braithwaite ruling again, and she was still wrong about it, and admitted it this time within 9 minutes, which he pointed out, and she threw a piece of bread at him. And then, when the plates were pushed aside and the fire had burned down to a red seam, she got up and went to the dresser and came back and set something on a table between them. A small, clear vial. Draco's hands went still. Granger. I brewed it on Thursday. Granger. Don't. She sat down. Her voice was perfectly steady, but her fingers went to her cuff, turned it once, smoothed it flat against her forearm, and then she noticed herself doing it and put both hands in her lap in a way he found almost unbearable. I'm not doing to you what you did to me. That's the entire point. It's sitting on the table in front of you, in the open, and I have told you exactly what it is. And there is no antidote in this flat, because I haven't brewed one. And if you say no, I will put it in the fire right now, and we will never speak of it. Then why is it there at all? Because you took it in a public courtroom in front of 200 strangers, she said, so that they would believe you. And I thought that was the most extraordinary thing I'd ever seen. And I also thought, walking home that night, in the wrong coat with no lining, that there is something obscene about a man being that honest with a room full of clerks, and never once being that honest with the person it's actually about. The fire settled. Draco reached out and picked up the vial and turned it in his fingers, and it caught the low red light and gave nothing back. No colour, no shadow, no answer. Ask me first, he said. What? Ask me first, without it. Whatever you were going to ask it now, while I can still lie to you, and then we'll both know what it was worth. Hermione's breath went out. All right. She looked at him across the table. Why did you say, close your eyes, open your mouth? He had not expected that. That's your question? That's my question. Not the file. Not your father. Not the courtroom. Not any of it. Her chin came up. You planned that afternoon for 11 weeks on graph paper. You chose the shop and the hour and the sweet. And then you said that in that voice, and I want to know whether it was in the plan." Draco set the vial down. "No," he said. "It wasn't in the plan." "Then what was it?" "It was the truth getting out ahead of me." His voice had gone low. "I'd been walking beside you in the sleet for 20 minutes, wanting to move a piece of hair off your face and not letting myself, and I opened my mouth to say something light and clever, and what came out was that, in a voice I've never heard myself use, and I heard it, and you heard it, and there were about 4 seconds on that bench where the entire plan was completely irrelevant to me." He met her eyes. "And I could not have told you at the time whether I wanted you to eat the sweet or throw it into the road and let me kiss you." The clock on the mantel went on ticking. The snow came down past the black window. Hermione reached out and took the vial off the table and dropped it into her pocket. "That's not a very rigorous experiment," Draco said unevenly. "You've no way of verifying it." "I've been verifying it since October," she said, and stood up and came round the table. He got to his feet. It was not graceful. He knocked the chair back, and it went over on the rug with a soft thump, and neither of them looked at it. And then she was there in front of him with the fire behind her, and her face tipped up and her hand curling into the front of his shirt, and the whole room seemed to tilt very slowly towards the point where they stood. "Close your eyes," Hermione said. Draco made a sound low in his throat. "That's cruel." "Yes." "Granger, close your eyes." And he closed them. He stood in a small warm room in Islington with snow going past the window, and his eyes shut, and his heart going like something trying to get out. And for 2 long seconds, nothing happened at all. Nothing but the fire and the clock and the sound of her breathing 4 inches from his mouth. Then her hand came up and moved a piece of hair off his forehead, slowly, the way he had wanted to do to her in the sleet and hadn't, and her palms stayed against his temple, and she kissed him. It was not gentle. It was not, whatever else it was, a woman being merciful. It was 11 weeks of a notebook in a kitchen drawer and a patch of floor by row 9, and a wrist held at a door on level 4, and he made a wrecked sound against her mouth and got both arms round her and pulled her in, and the table shifted and something rolled off it, and neither of them cared, and her fingers went into his hair and closed. When they finally broke apart, neither of them went far. Her forehead was against his jaw. His hand was flat between her shoulder blades and staying there. "Say something," she said. "I can't." "You can. You've said hundreds of things. You said 40,000 words to a Wizengamot clerk in one afternoon." "That was easier." She laughed against his throat, and he felt it, and closed his eyes again. "Then I'll say it," Hermione said. "I knew what was in that sweet before it touched my tongue. I took the antidote. I sat down anyway. And I have thought about why for 3 months, and the answer is very simple, and I'm going to say it once." She lifted her head. "I wanted you to ask me something true. That's all. That is the entire thing. I have never once in my life been asked something true by somebody who was that frightened of the answer. And when you asked it, I would have told you with or without the potion. And I did, and I do it again." Draco looked down at her. "Ask me now," he said. "Anything." Hermione smiled. The small, crooked, disarming thing with the firelight in it this time instead of sleet. "No," she said. "I've decided I'd rather find out slowly." And she took hold of his collar and pulled him back down, and the fire burned low in the grate. And outside the snow came down over Islington and covered the railings and the parked cars and the whole quiet street. And somewhere across the city, 9 floors underground, a green lamp guttered over an empty patch of stone floor that neither of them was ever going to need again.
Hi, thank you for listening to that. I want to tell you one small thing about writing this story. There is a moment I keep coming back to. It is the echo. Draco is sitting on the cold floor. He is talking about his mother, and Hermione moves. She does not take his hand. She does not say, "I am sorry." She just moves 1 inch so her shoulder touches his shoulder, and she stays there. I wrote that scene 4 times. I kept trying to make her say something kind. Every time it was worse, because she was right. A hand on the arm would have made him leave. A shoulder is not pity. A shoulder is just company. That is what I was thinking about the whole time I wrote this. How hard it is for some people to accept love, not because they do not want it, because they think they do not deserve it. Draco tried to steal the truth. He had a plan, he had a bottle in his pocket, and then he sat down and he did not ask a single question about the file. He asked her if she thinks about him. That is the moral I think. We ask for what we truly want, even when we have spent months pretending we want something else. Our first question is always honest, and Hermione, she knew. She knew from the beginning. She could have stopped him. She chose to sit down and listen instead. Sometimes love is not a grand rescue. Sometimes it is just one person deciding to stay in the room. Thank you for staying in the room with me. I will see you in the next story.